Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell of the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with climate economist Steve Keen. We're going to be speaking about the current 2025 economic crisis. Keen's been active for decades in both economics and in dealing with thermodynamics, climate, and this kind of thing. We're not going to go into climate today. We're going to talk about the what we might call an economic or financial atomic bomb that's going on. So welcome, Steve. Nice to see you.
Good to be in touch again, mate. Long time since we've seen each other. About
Yeah,
three
good to see
years,
you,
four
Bob.
years, I think. Yeah.
Let me start off with this wide question that I had for you that I had sent earlier. With so much going on, I mean, how is it that we can even, can you try to give us some kind of contours of what's going on over this past week or two first?
Oh, well, I mean, it's the absolute on again, off again issue of tariffs, obviously, that's causing most of the confusion. Though you're also getting wholesale slashing of the various wings of the American government without any regard to whether that still means the bird can remain in flight or not. And then reaction by other countries. So China is looking like it's putting a complete trade embargo on America, very strategically done. They've obviously been aware something crazy like this could happen. And then realignment of trading blocks globally. In the middle of all this, anybody who's got shares, position in share markets, it's just it's putting the VIX through the roof in terms of people's uncertainty about the near future. So it's a very, very difficult time. I've just seen some numbers today on Twitter. You've got to rely upon your news sources when you can, of something like a 60% fall in trading volumes coming through Californian ports.
I saw
Now,
that. Yeah,
that's just, we're looking at that level of disruption to global markets.
unbelievable.
So yeah, it's a time of extreme volatility and all caused by an American president.
So you're talking about, say, coming through Long Beach or there in Seattle, this kind of thing. You've got
Yeah, all the
messages.
coastal ones. Obviously open to China as the main source, but
Yes.
China's basically, you've poked the dragon. Okay, so and the dragon is a lot bigger than it was 40 years ago,
Yes.
and this is the I think the realism that Americans haven't got their heads around, the extent to which China has probably exceeded them in numerous categories of industrial capability, military capability as well. Though America's invaded. What's the ratio? The ratio of American invasions to other countries' invasions of China in the last 50 years is close to infinite. But China did invade Vietnam. Okay, let's not forget that.
Yeah, they have a long
The
history.
yeah, the post Vietnam post American War invasion of Vietnam by China was repelled in a matter of months. So that's the only time China's taken up arms against any other country, and that was of course still under Mao. Um, Fast forward, nothing since they've been under Deng Xiaoping and subsequent. So China's got every right to be aggrieved that they're being treated as the aggressor in this whole thing. But that's the perception Americans have, and they really have no idea of how big the dragon is that they're now poking.
From what I could see is that what Trump had done, of course, Trump is or the U.S. is in a position of advantage, right? Because what is it, at least 30 or 40% of trade is going into the U.S. So there's a surplus for China, deficit for the U.S. So that would put the U.S. in a position of advantage. And this is why Trump is using that advantage, but it didn't work, right?
Well, he's thinking he has an advantage. I mean, there's also, you would know that there's a particular faction that says running a trade deficit is good for you. And I think that's nonsense. But Trump sees it as a weakness. And I think, frankly, he's more correct on that front. But the thing is, what is your trade deficit in? If you're thinking in old world, 50, 60 years ago, type idea, or even the last century, 19th century stuff, which is where Trump is saying he wants to return to the 19th century.
Right.
Uh, Stuff was made in one country, made in one country by one company, exported to another company in another country. It was hands free, hand distance relationships, and single point of production and distribution. Now you've got a massively globalized economy, so stuff is passing through as many as 5 countries, being reprocessed before a product turns up in a final
Mhm.
consumer good. So the tariffs are absolutely chaotic on that front. And a lot of what you're buying is inputs for other stages of your production. Now, it's fine if you rival consumer goods. That's the sort of thinking that I think is behind Trump's tariffs. When it's rival inputs to production, and they all come from China because so many, the one of the obvious ones that Z has just already targeted is no more rare earths being exported to America.
Right.
And because China is by far the major exporter of those, then you can't easily open up a rival. So you're shooting yourself in the foot. So this is one of the dangers of the way it's being done. There's more dependency. America's more dependent on China than China is on America when it comes to producing output. That's the point that Trump hasn't realized.
Steve, give us some ideas on this. So let's say 17th, 18th century British Raj, they import indigo from say I don't know, Madras or something into the Manchester mills. Okay, so there's
Mm.
this coming in today. What kind of things are we looking at? Say like parts of an airplane, parts of an iPhone. Where's all?
Yeah.
Okay, how does this work?
Oh, look, I'm not an expert on supply chains, but
Right, right.
what you can see is that you'll have a range of components made in a factory in China, for example. There's one of the examples you would have seen on Twitter, I'm sure. A product being exported from China, imported through California, goes down to Mexico for reworking, crosses the border, goes back down to Mexico, and goes up to Canada and crosses the border again. Now, and that's often happening inside one company that has got different production plans for different foci around the world. And so if they actually legitimately uh, comply with the law, they're going to be facing tariffs on the one component 4 and 5 and 6 times. That is hugely disruptive. That means you can't continue with that supply chain period. So you shut it down. So this is actually far more drastic than you would think if you still think in terms of the way that trade is taught in neoclassical textbooks. So, exports from one country to another country, both hands free, no companies involved. Now it's at least 40% of global trade is transfers within one company between countries, taking advantage of various tax regimes and wage costs and so on. And suddenly Trump is just mangling all that. And so the companies that are looking at it are now trying to have to work out legal ways to get around the obstructions. And what Trump hopes to do is persuade them to move production back onshore, reversing what has been a 50-year program by American corporations to outsource and take advantage of cheap wages. So what we're really seeing is the comeuppance to the success that China's had in doing that. And like one little, I mention this in every time I talk about China, is I went to China in 81, 82, and I saw the beginning of the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone. And that was literally, I was there when they were laying the concrete. And we were told of the proposal, the way they were going to get American corporations to relocate. And the idea was that they would offer them, obviously far lower wage costs, lower
Right.
environmental costs as well, to shift over. But the condition was they had to have a local partner, and within 5 years, the local partner had to own 50% of the business. Now, I don't know if that was carried through. That was the proposal I heard when they were opening up the site. But the American corporations that even contemplate that gives you an idea of the wage differential they were looking at. Now, that's
It's
over 40
gone.
years ago.
Right.
Well, 40 years of growth of China running at least like in real terms every seven, a real growth rate of the order of 7% per annum. That means that you double every 10 years in terms of your per capita income. So you've got, double, quadruple, eightfold, 16-fold.
Mhm.
So the income level of China in the aggregate over that period is increased per capita by a factor of 16, whereas Americans have been maybe if they're lucky, they've got 1% per capita, and talk about distribution of income. The working class and middle class have not got anything like that. It's all gone to their elite. So if you want to compare the living standards of working class Americans to the living standards of, let's say mainly coastal elite, working class Chinese, but it's still at least the population of America. They're quite possibly comparable.
Mhm.
But what has happened as well is that because America has outsourced production, the skill level in America has gone backwards. There were far more skilled workers per head 40 years ago in America than there are now. The machine tools in particular have been degraded dramatically. In China, fantastic expansion of people's uh, STEM capabilities, and you've got a far more uh, educated and trained and innovative workforce in China now than you have in America. And so America thinks it's negotiating from a position of strength, but I think it's actually a position of weakness.
Two things, backing up just a moment. When you describe one corporation bringing things in, moving them across borders and all this sounds like a command economy to
Oh
me.
yeah, that's the classic thing. I mean, neoclassicals and Austrian economists obsess about how much competition is so much better than potential planning. And at the aggregate level, that's true. There's actually
The aggregate.
brilliant work by a Hungarian economist called János Kornai, who wanted to understand why it was that socialist economies grew far less rapidly than Western and innovated far less as well. And his conclusion was that the socialist system gave you what he called supply constrained economies. So if everybody's suffering from a lack of inputs. You didn't get enough inputs to make the outputs you were required to do by the plan. So the easiest way to solve that was to produce last year's output, never change the product. And again, another little cameo of mine. This is when I was still a student. I think I was, what was I, 22, yeah, 21, 22. My then girlfriend's brother wanted to buy a 650cc motorbike. He couldn't afford a Japanese one. Back in the 70s, Kawasaki's and Yamahas and Hondas were the hot items. So he found he could buy a Russian one, of course called a Cossack, for 650 Australian dollars, when the equivalent American, so Japanese was 3,000 Australian dollars. Australian dollars worth more than an American back then, by the way. So you got the thing delivered. It came in a wooden crate. We took off the wooden crate and found a whole bunch of oily rags. I mean, saturated with oil. We took those off, and on the pallet, underneath all that stuff, was a 1942 BMW.
Oh,
Okay, so a 1975 Cossack was a 1942 BMW. They simply stole the design, and
so
it complete to having like it wasn't even a motorcycle seat. You sat on a bicycle saddle. There's a bicycle seat to sit on, a large bicycle seat. So that was no innovation occurred. Now, what Cornay argued is that to actually get innovation, you needed what he called a demand constrained system. So in that case, rather than having one factory pumping out one type of motorbike for the entire economy, which was the Russian approach. You have a multitude of different firms all competing, classic capitalist situation, but with more awareness of how capitalism actually functions in the Chinese case. So you got innovation occurring there, and then you got a range of different products, and the best one hopefully wins out in the market. Certainly the second best one at least does. But what happens inside those companies, they work under command structures. And this is the thing that if the market was, ultimately efficient, every worker would be subcontracting to buy inputs from the worker before them in a production line and sell them to the next one. It just doesn't work. It's
that's
far better to have a command. So internally, these function as socialist enterprises. You do what the boss tells you. But the better firms, again, this is something which Americans have lost. The reason that Japanese firms overtook America so successfully until the bubble economy hit in the 1980s was quality circles and then how that fitted in with Japanese culture at the time after the Second World War. Every worker was consulted about what they thought should happen. And then with people might have forgotten Deming by now, but Deming, who was the American engineer whose ideas about how to improve American engineering were rejected by Americans because they just won the World War II and don't tell us how to do anything we already know. Deming moved to Japan,
right.
worked with the ministry, the MITI, International Trade and Industry
It,
Department,
that's the
to
main
bring in
core.
just in time.
MITI is the
Pardon?
main, that's the core driver, right? MITI and the whole system in Japan.
The MITI
MITI.
was,
Yeah.
and again, like this is the case. This is the theory where capitalism gets taught how to produce by socialism. The MITI that took Deming's ideas, passed it through the entire Japanese economy, and they all developed the idea of just in time. Now, people think just in time is mainly about minimizing stocks, which is true. But the way the factories are designed was rather than the production line, you turn it on and it just gets faster and never stops, which is the Fordist approach. Deming said you must fix defects before they're passed on. You eliminate reworking, which is a huge part of American manufacturing at the time. So they said, every worker can stop the line. Literally, line stops. Everybody goes, what's wrong at this point? What's not working? Fix this up.
Right,
Line
right.
starts again. Another worker stops it. Ultimately, at the stage it's working, there's no quality flaws in the manufacturing process. Now, China has taken that brilliantly as well, but to do it, you've got to have an internal command structure. And the command structure has to work both ways. So as well as telling the workers what to do, the worker has to tell the management what should be done. And it's a combination of the two. It's not outright, it's not a dictatorship in that sense. It's a collective enterprise. And that works more effectively internally than having a market everywhere.
You call that a collective enterprise rather than like a top-down structure, or what is the term for that?
Yeah, I think it's collective. I mean, again, you look at some of the things which apply to Japanese corporations. I'm sure the Chinese have taken similar ideas, and that is you set a ceiling between the top and the lowest remunerated person in the company. So you don't get the feeling you're all working for this asshole who lives in the C-suite and never talks to you and doesn't go to the same cafeteria. There's some extent to which you see yourself as a community, and then that gives you a more effective management. I'm not saying it happens in every company in China. I mean,
Well,
Foxconn has got all
huge.
sorts of notorious stories about, suicide nets to stop workers jumping out and killing themselves and
Mhm.
horrific practices like that. I expect to find there's more effective innovation and more effective worker management feedback in Chinese corporations than there is in American right now.
Mhm. So we've got a basis here for what's happening, right? So there's a,
Mm,
let's say, and almost not just an illusion, there's a delusion about China going on. One is manufacturing processes, how precise they are, and the fact that the wages are high. The other is
mm,
China's an aggressor, militarily and all of this. But
which
it
it
is
ain't. Mm.
now,
It's imperial, but it's imperial in the
sure,
old-fashioned sense. If you fall under the sphere of influence of the regent,
right.
but they don't invade you and they don't replace your. Whereas the Americans have invaded and wiped out quite regularly the ruling groups of the countries they move into, and wonder why things don't work.
Bring us up to right now then. So if you have a Washington that's not on the even the same page as reality, or at least some
Mm.
kind of empirical reality. And they started throwing on these tariffs. What was it, 140% to China?
125, I think, is
On, on,
is rounding error when you get that high.
on Japan, it was like 45%. I couldn't believe that.
Mm.
That's just going to make China and Vietnam go to, I said Japan, but I mean Vietnam, 45%. That's just going to integrate the system. So first of all, what is this delusion? And then next, what is that going to do to say where I'm at here in ASEAN, China, India, East Asia?
Well, it's the delusion that America is the most important customer on the planet. It was 50, 60 years ago the biggest market for the destroyed states of Europe to sell into after the Second World War was the American market.
Mhm.
So, and like as part of that whole process, America ultimately had to start running a trade deficit because, again, America insisted that the international currency should be the dollar. The proposal that Keynes put forward to Bretton Woods was to form a neutral currency he called the Bancor for international trade. In fact, it wouldn't have been a currency, it would have been simply a clearinghouse. So if you had a country running an export surplus would get a positive balance, a country running a trade deficit with a negative balance, the total sum would be zero. And that was a way of just avoiding the nonsense of having a national currency. Now, the Americans, under Harry Dexter White, and there's all sorts of suspicious things about White in the background, but I think the prominent thing was an imperial attitude. We won World War II. We should become the international currency. Whereas, of course, before that it was Britain, as if that was a good thing. Now, it is a good thing for the financial sector because everybody needs your currency, so your financial tentacles travel into every other country on the planet, and that's where we got the vampire squids from, the merchant banks and the power they yield and so on. So it definitely massively strengthened the American financial system. But what it meant was America, to enable countries to use American dollars for trade, America had to run a trade deficit.
Mhm.
You had to have the American dollars turning up in third-party countries, and the extent that became overwhelming in 1970, the 1970s, with France in particular, and with the idea the dollar was convertible into gold too.
Mhm.
That meant that if you got a large enough trade surplus with America, you'd accumulate enough dollars in your account at the Federal Reserve in New York, which that's where the dollars effectively were stored, and it was electronic rather than physical, of course. De Gaulle had enough dollars in that account. France had enough dollars to say we can buy all the gold in Fort Knox, and de Gaulle threatened to do that. This is a piece of history I'm familiar with. I'm old enough to know. I've got a feeling a lot of people that don't remember that, but de Gaulle, the great war hero from France, he just threatened he was going to turn up at Fort Knox and say, "Here's my check from the Federal Reserve. Give me all your gold." Now, the interesting thing is, this is something again I can't find the research that I read on this almost 50 years ago because it was all in paper, of course. But the economic congressional office, the economic office of the Congress, congressional had a congressional hearing into what caused the motivation to devalue the currency. And yes, de Gaulle's threat was part of it, but the final clincher was that a lot of American corporations expected a devaluation,
I see.
and that devaluation meant that because they expected it, General Motors Europe would be trading with General Motors America, and they'd decide to delay asking for payment.
Oh,
Okay, because if you wait a while, you're going to get more. You euro to there's not going to be, say, the franc to American dollar would go from, say, 5 to 1 to 2 to 1. Okay, well, you'd want to get the exchange before the devaluation occurred. So
I
they
see.
went from 30 days to 60 days to 90 days for settlement in one direction, and 30 days to 10 days in the opposite. And that caused the rebalancing, literally shuffling money from from the American branch of a transnational to the European branch of the transnational, waiting for the devaluation. That was such a large transfer that it actually forced Nixon's hand.
So
So
that's what
American
happened right
corporation,
before August 1971.
yes, that's right, yeah.
Okay.
So that was a lead up to the actual breaking with the gold standard by Nixon. So you have both France threatening to bring its dollars back and get the gold, and then American corporations shuffling where their money was distributed between their various multinational branches to have as much money offshore to take advantage of the American dollar being devalued. Okay. So this is one the internal, like 40% roughly. I'm not an expert on this anymore. I was in the past, but
Mhm.
something of the order of 40% of global trade is intra-corporate. Okay.
Mhm.
Now that means forget about the hands-free, distant relationship between traders. This is the same bloody body either side of an ocean. So again, the command structure goes beyond one country. In other words, so they exploited that and forced the devaluation. Now that we still have that same situation, and that huge proportion of international trade is intra-corporate, and so they are looking at what Trump is doing, and where Trump is thinking he's disrupting another national economy. He's disrupting lots of corporate systems,
I
and
see.
that's the chaos we're going through.
Let me ask you just a quick question on this bank call clearinghouse. This was around Keynes and the Bretton Woods. What would that would be a currency, but it wouldn't be like a speculative currency, right? It would
No,
just be
no, you couldn't trade in it.
like a
The
ledger.
idea, the idea was for the Bancor that it would be a unit of account used at the International Clearing Union. So if you were trying to export something from America to China, they're talking 40, 50 years ago, then there would be a positive balance. The American company would convert its American would to do the purchase. It would go through International Clearinghouse. So American Chinese yuan would go down, the bank account goes down
Right.
because you were buying something. That means you then have a drop in your foreign exchange holdings at the central bank. That drop in the current exchange holdings transfers to an increase in what you've got in the Bancor
Right.
in the at the clearing out, and the opposite transaction for the purchasing side, the country doing the importing. And Keynes, and this is where, we're very different to modern arguments you're seeing about trade deficits being a good thing. Keynes saw trade surpluses as being a positive for the country running a trade surplus. You're effectively outsourcing money creation. If you own a trade surplus, then money created in another country is being transferred into your foreign reserves and creating domestic banking reserves and domestic banking accounts.
Right.
So a surplus nation is sort of exploiting deficit nations, the opposite of what Trump thinks. I know actually what Trump thinks. In this particular case, I'm agreeing with Trump. Okay, so it's the opposite of what critics of Trump are saying. So it's right that a trade deficit undermines your viability, but a trade surplus, from Keynes's point of view, is a very seductive tactic for a country to grow faster than its rivals, and it reduces the level of aggregate demand globally. So Keynes's idea was to limit both trade surpluses and trade deficits
Right.
and to boost demand. So inside the Bancor, after you had a quota based on your total level of trade, okay? And you might get the actual working quota might be half the value of your total exports plus imports. Okay? So therefore, America gets a much larger quota than anybody else, of course, in that system. Initially, going back to the 1940s, post-war period, then if you have a trade deficit or a trade surplus larger than half your quota, then you start paying interest on it.
Mhm.
And that applies to both the surplus and the deficit nations. So past a certain point, and I'm going to use a rough, let's say it's 2% of exports and imports being 2% of GDP, or the balance, you have many exports and imports as you like, but if your balance of trade was either positive or negative 2% of your GDP, then you start paying interest on the total balance. And that interest was transferred to third world countries as development funding.
I see.
So, okay. And then what they meant was with those Bancor, the only things that you can use Bancors for is buying goods of other countries. So by giving the third world countries the Bancor, that then meant they were going to be purchased from both surplus and deficit nations. So the whole idea was to encourage aggregate demand, to expand it, and to limit trade deficits as a destabilizing factor in the global economy. That's what we should have had.
Mhm.
Instead, we got the system where the Americans are dominant.
Can we, okay, so what you're describing is the lead up to it, whether they're saying Bretton Woods 2.0 or a new monetary order.
Yeah.
How possible is that?
I think this is one thing you can probably thank Trump for, that he may actually trigger that, because one of the arguments that Keynes made against having a national currency as the currency for international trade is that you're beholden to the financial fate of that particular country.
Mhm.
Now, for a while, America used that extremely effectively, the financialization of the global economy. That's why we talk about merchant banks more than we talk about innovative capitalists these days. It's
Mhm.
tragic on that front. But it undermined their manufacturing sector at the same time because the dollar had to be overvalued. So the argument was that it isn't only just bad for the global system, it's bad for the country producing the reserve currency as well,
Right.
because their dollar is needed not just to buy their own goods, but buy goods from anywhere. You get a demand for their currency over and above the demand for the commodities being exported by that country. The exchange rate rises, it's a more expensive dollar, but it therefore means your manufacturers are at a costing disadvantage.
Okay.
So it's actually a curse. Okay?
But
Being the reserve currency is not a spoil of war; it's a curse of war.
I was trying to think of what Mark Twain might say about what just happened. Let me give you my analogy. It would be
Yeah,
like, Trump and the plutocrats, they go out, in the duck blind. They're going hunting ducks. The plutocrats are looking out, trying to find out what they can get. Trump, for some reason, takes the shotgun and shoots the bottom of the boat while trying to confront China, but they have to have the dollar to be able to be stable, to be able to confront China. Is this,
Yeah, yeah.
this, what,
It's crazy.
would
It's
Mark
crazy.
Twain say
So,
something like that?
well, he'd certainly say that it isn't what you don't know that gets you; it's what you know for sure that just ain't true.
Right,
And that's what we're seeing here. So you have Trump believing that being the reserve currency is a good thing. In fact, it's a bad thing. It'd
right,
be better if we got rid of that curse for America's sake. And then the rest of the world looking at it and saying, for God's sake, the international financial system has been weaponized by the Americans.
sure.
We need an alternative. So in that situation, with both Trump, it'd actually benefit if the American dollar ceased carrying the burden of being the international unit for exchange.
Okay.
China, of obviously, and lots of European countries, Canada as well, Greenland, all the things he intends invading and taking over, Mexico, all those countries think, holy shit, we need to get away from the Americans as soon as possible. What else can we do? So I've got a feeling there's more of a chance for the Bancor proposal now than at any time in history since Keynes first put it forward.
Some of this is really comical. I mean, there's a lot of suffering going on, but when I think of this, I think of just 120 years ago with Mark Twain. And when I listen to you describe it, it definitely is. We're at that point. Steve, thanks so much for your time. And let me check back in with you in, I don't know, 4 or 6 months and see if we're headed to this kind of new monetary order.
Will do.
Yeah, this is Layne Hartsell, Korea IT Times.